Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by OnlineGreatBooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas. I'm Scott Hambrick.
And I'm Karl Schute.
Today on the Online Great Books podcast, we're going to talk about G.K. Chesterton's, I don't know what it is. It's a set of essays or newspaper articles, and it's titled What I Saw in America. One of these travel books.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, before we started this, I was telling Scott, I'm a little bit down today. The current situation has me down. It is May 7th, 2020. I had to pull up my calendar and check, because who knows anymore. I was thinking about it. Chesterton's 1984 was probably the exact wrong book to do in the current situation. Chesterton, any of his books, I think, might be the perfect antidote. If I had one word to describe him, it'd probably be cheerful. He's a polemicist. He's fighting battles for the people he cares about, which are the people. We'll get into that. But he's funny and cheerful, even when he's doing it. One of his best friends is George Bernard Shaw, who is not cheerful at all. Huh. You know, and so how can he be friends with somebody whose opinions were so different from his, or H.G. Wells? But he was just perpetually happy, even when he's cutting things to pieces. And I thought, I want to give you a sample quote here, and then we can talk about him a little bit more. So this is it's somewhere in the beginning. Kindle, well, you don't have my Kindle edition. So he made this trip in 1922 to the United States. Prohibition was in effect. And so he says this line, "The saloons no longer existed when I was there, owing to the recent reform which restricted intoxicants to the wealthier classes." And I just think that's a perfect line right there. That's just, it's everything you need to know. It's talking about prohibition. It's talking about wealth, it's talking about privilege, and it's talking about the people he cares about, which are the ordinary folks who can't go get a drink anymore. But the rich people in Chicago or in New York could go get a drink, but not anybody else. Just perfectly in one sentence. It's funny. One perfect little sentence that gets everything pretty much that he cares about.
He's a perpetual outsider, so he sees everything clean, you know. I have a friend, my friend Dallas says, you can have all the justice you can afford, and you could have all the alcohol you could afford in the Prohibition era. And he saw it. You know, I can imagine all these people were whining. He would go to New York City, and New York Times luminaries would be whining and dining him and wanting to spend time with him and pulling out their brandy and their wine and their stores. Mm-hmm. And he talks about the stores, and they never seem to run low.
Yeah, it's just stuff you had before Prohibition went into effect, right? Right. Well, you know Gatsby's based on a real person.
I did not know that.
It's some guy, I think in Cincinnati, who made millions getting medical alcohol out to the people that wanted it. And if you went to one of his parties, he'd give you a car. There'd just be a line of Packards and keys in them. Take your car and go. So one of the concerns that he has is plutocracy.
Mm. Yeah.
Plutocracy. Saloons were not inns. If they had been inns, it would have been far harder even for the power of modern plutocracy to root them out. Well, Pluto is the god of wealth in Roman mythology. This is not Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, Hades isn't the god of wealth, but Pluto takes over both jobs. So he's the god of death, god of the underworld, and the god of wealth. Huh. And Mickey's dog, which doesn't make any sense because isn't Goofy a dog?
I haven't thought of that.
So how does Mickey have a friend who's a dog thing and then have a pet who's a dog?
The devil mouse. They weird ways over there at Disney.
So that's one of his concerns, is the preservation of country life, the preservation of, he calls it the peasantry.
He loves the peasantry. When he calls you a peasant, it is not a bad thing.
No, well, what is a peasant?
Just a person that's just taking care of their affairs.
Well, it's also somebody who has land.
So he talks about squires too. Is a squire a peasant, or are a peasant squires?
I don't know. I think the squire would be richer.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah, he loves the smallholder, and he talks about in this book the people of the Midwest are his like peasant ideal, because it's just almost entirely in 1922. It's pre-Dust Bowl, and it's just agriculture, and it's not industrialized. It's just agriculture, and he loves that. He thinks that's the best life for people.
He actually ends out in Oklahoma. Maybe we should save that. Oh, there's so much good stuff in this. So this is just a reaction. I picked this book because when you deal with Chesterton, he also deals in religious controversy, and some of his best books deal with that. And I wanted to keep that a little bit back burner, So he has a religious conversion late in his life and becomes a Catholic. He'd been one by intellectual disposition for a long time, but it took him a long time to get there.
Everybody knew it but him.
Yeah, everybody knew it but him. But his most famous book is probably Orthodoxy, which is a wonderful read, but might be a little bit too, I don't know, maybe we'll read it someday.
It's too orthodox for this show.
Yeah, there's one story that I remember from him. So I had a biography of his that I read that I lent out to our mutual friend Chris in Michigan. I hope he enjoyed it. I never got it back. So Chesterton had long hair, and he would go to the barber maybe every 2 weeks. And he was in a hurry, and there's a kid in front of him at the barbershop. And so he pays the kid a shilling, whatever a small English coin is, to let him go in front of him in line. And 2 weeks later, there's 5 kids, and he pays them and gets his hair cut. And then 4 weeks later, there's like 25 kids, and he just chuckles and starts paying them all. And I think that's a hint of his personality, not getting angry about it, but just laughing. I don't know. He's a glorious person. I hope you get to know him.
This book is in danger of getting memory hold. He uses words you're not supposed to use.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, there's some of that. Well, it's 1922. There's some words that would not be in polite company these days. So if you're of delicate disposition, I think maybe you ought to probably get over it and read the book.
Just read it anyway. Yeah, no kidding. What happened to sticks and stones? Like, how many times did you yell that at somebody on the school bus? And we don't say that anymore.
Words are violence, Scott.
We'll read about that later. But he uses words that were perfectly acceptable, and frankly, that he uses with goodwill.
Yeah.
That would prevent this book from being read in almost any school that receives government money.
Oh, sure. It's the same thing with, some other works.
Like, when can we not watch Richard Pryor or listen to Richard Pryor comedy albums? When does that happen?
Next week, probably.
Next week, May 14th, 2020. There's a lot here that a lot of people would rail at. I refuse to think that they would find it offensive. I think that they just raise hell because they can. But he's a man of goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
In the last chapter, it's about democracy, and he talks about Jefferson's line about all men being created equal. And I think he even has a broader, better understanding of that he carries around with him than, I don't know, I'm not going to say than Jefferson did, but his understanding of it is better than the one set forth in the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. Dear listener, let's give you a reason to hang on. I think maybe towards the end of the podcast, we'll talk about his comments on Jefferson at the end of the book, which I thought were really interesting.
Very interesting.
Really interesting. So just stay tuned.
The book's a slow roll. It's him just making observations about architecture in New York City and hotels and a few things, and him dropping his Chesterton style funny lines and observations. But it just gets deeper and heavier and more important as it goes on.
Yeah, I thought this is kind of Montaigne, but funnier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The same kind of rambling presentation. He can write a book that's straightforward. He's done it, but this one is leisurely. So I want to go, this would be in the first subdivision of the book, What is America? We're going to have trouble, Scott and I, coordinating our paragraphs here.
I don't think so. I'm in the Kindle.
Well, we're probably at different Kindle versions. This is all out of copyright, so a lot of people are selling you Chesterton. So he says, let me begin my American impressions with 2 impressions I had before I went to America. One was an incident and the other an idea, and when taken together, they illustrate the attitude I mean. The first principle is that nobody should be ashamed of thinking a thing funny because it is foreign. The second is that he should be ashamed of thinking it's wrong because it is funny. So if I come down to Oklahoma and I hear everybody saying, dang it. Dang it. I saw a heat map, I think we talked about this last time, of the people who say dang in the United States, and Oklahoma's like the center of the heat map of dang it.
What's the alternative?
There's
darn, dern,
well, there's
consarnate.
the 4-letter alternatives,
Yeah.
which we say up in Chicago. I know a guy in Oklahoma who'd been a roommate. I suppose he's still around somewhere. He was a priest in Oklahoma, but he went to seminary up in Chicago, and he had a roommate who was from Chicago, and the roommate let fly an expletive that begins with S, and the fellow from Oklahoma was just so shocked because it was so abrupt and clipped, and it was like a baseball bat to the face, and when he would say it would have like 3 or 4 syllables.
Right.
So you laugh at it, right? So you laugh at the customs that you see. They're funny. They're funny to you. It's okay. It's okay to find the customs of the Japanese, should you go to Tokyo, to find some of their customs funny. Oh, they all take their shoes off everywhere, and they're bowing everywhere, and it's kind of funny. But the bad thing would be to think, because it's funny, it must be wrong.
He cautions people over and over again. Observe it, find it funny, never sneer.
Right. Why would you say dang in Oklahoma, and we would say all of the bad words in Chicago?
Well,
there's probably some reasons.
Yeah, because it lets you, it's not puritanical. It lets you hold the really good ones back for when you really need it.
Yeah, so I don't know what to say when I really want to swear. I'm out of words.
Right.
I've gone through my catalog. So, yeah, I think that's really good. So he's coming to America, and he's finding things that are funny to him, that are unusual. And the typical thing, I suppose, that an English traveler would do, he's very, very English, but an English traveler would, write things about how silly the Americans were. They're all cowboys, and they're weird. And aren't they silly? And we're much more cultured in London than they are in Kansas. And that's not the right way to do it. The right way is to go understand Kansas. And he says there's one thing that he thought was really weird. When you showed up in the United States in 1922, they would give you a test. And it would say on this paper, are you an anarchist? Before they'd let you in the country. And he describes an earlier trip he'd made to the Middle East, somewhere in that they didn't care what his political opinions were, as long as he didn't shoot anybody.
Yeah, I think it was Turkey. Yeah, and I thought about thought crime. They're trying to sniff out thought crime before you even show up in the United States. And he says, so we'll see if our editions are the same here. At the bottom of page 4, among many things that amused me almost to the point of treating the form, thus this is the form he's having to fill out about, are you an anarchist? Do you want to overthrow the government? Almost to the point of treating the form thus disrespectfully. The most amusing was the thought of the ruthless outlaw who should feel compelled to treat it respectfully. And I wrote here, gun control. Bad people will obey laws.
Sure.
We live out this that fiction every single day in the country still.
Well, I guess it's funny, but then you try to figure out the reason for it. Why would you ask such things? Somewhere in here he's got a line where they ask, do you intend to overthrow the government? And he says, against this I should write, I prefer to answer that question at the end of my tour and not the beginning. But there's questions about political opinions, and he draws the conclusion that, because what he says here, a man's perfectly entitled to laugh at a thing because he happens to find it incomprehensible. What he has no right to do is to laugh at it as incomprehensible, then criticize it as if he comprehended it. So why would they ask questions of your political beliefs? And his conclusion is he thinks it's because the United States in 1922 is, he's got a good line. The American Constitution does resemble the Spanish Inquisition in this, that it is founded on a creed. America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed. And so that the questions of your opinions and judgments are important because the whole nation was founded on opinions and judgments. At least in the Declaration it is. Whether that's the case anymore is, that's another question. But if you're going to go visit France, nobody cares what your opinions are. At least they didn't then. Is France founded on an idea? Well, maybe in the French Revolution it was.
Fraternity. Equality.
Is England founded on an idea?
No.
No, it's just there. It's just the people who live there. Maybe that's the whole America's an idea thing. I have mixed feelings about that.
Yeah, it's not. It's that and maybe, perhaps.
Yeah. But do you see what he's trying to do? He's trying to understand it. Why aren't these questions stupid? Yes, I find them funny, but why aren't they stupid? What were people getting at? Presumably, you always think about this. The people you're talking to, the people you're yelling at on Faceagram or Instabook, presume that they're somewhat rational and they have good reasons to think what they think, rather than putting them in the category of stupid, evil, people to be sent to the gulag.
He tries so hard to understand this, and I don't necessarily abide by his creedal nation thing here, and he throws out the whole melting pot metaphor that we've all had poured in our ears since we went to kindergarten. Yeah. But then he follows up with that introduction of that idea. He says, even that metaphor implies that the pot itself is of a certain shape and a certain substance, a pretty solid substance. The melting pot must not melt. And the original shape was traced on the lines of Jeffersonian democracy, and it will remain in that shape until it becomes shapeless. America invites all men to become citizens, but it implies the dogma that there is such a thing as citizenship.
Right.
I think that's an important distinction that is often lost.
So you and I think, are a little skeptical of America as an idea. I wonder if we're skeptical of it because of the practical shape that it's taken, or because there's a problem with the idea. If you had...
Do I have to pick?
Well, I don't know. Let me make my case first, and then you can...
I should say, by the way, that we're in the same room together.
Shh. Don't tell anyone.
We're not breaking laws where I'm from. Karl had to run a blockade. It was like Mad Max to get here. It's good.
Gosh, what was I saying? Okay, so if America is in fact an idea, what's the idea? If there's an idea of citizenship, what is it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would have much less difficulty with it if we actually have the idea, which Chesterton focuses on. He says somewhere else in here, it's the Declaration of Independence. It's the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, which is a beautiful thing. I know we got a member on Slack who thinks it's not. He's real skeptical about it. He thinks Jefferson was lying. I don't care.
We'll talk about that here at the end of this, in the last chapter of this book, about what Chesterton thought about whether he was lying.
Yeah, but if you're going to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that's a nice creed, you know? Mm-hmm. If you really believe that, that might be a basis for a nation. If truth is whatever you make it to be, then you don't have the Declaration of Independence, and then you don't have America as an idea. For me, the problem is not that it's an idea. The problem is that, do we still believe in the idea?
No. The Declaration of Independence reference has always bothered me. I think a great deal of it. In fact, it's over there graven in leather. I've been meaning to hang that on the wall. Jared Markle gave me a parchment Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. It is not an addendum or codicil or attachment or Schedule A to the Constitution. We had the Articles of Confederation between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It is, I don't know, I may have some constitutional scholar or some attorney email me and tell me otherwise. It's not part of our statutes.
It's not a law code, it's an act. I remember reading a philosopher a while back, I forget his name, who talked about language as performatives. Sometimes you use language not to communicate, but to do a deed. Like, I take you, charity, which I presume you said at some point.
Sure.
That's a deed. It's an action. The declaration is a declaration. It makes something happen after it's signed that was not true before it was signed. And the thing that it makes happen is...
What can undo that thing?
Well, I don't know. But the thing that it did was make an independent nation. Before July 3rd, there wasn't any such thing. July 4th, there was. It's the justification and the document that made it happen. And then Washington had to hold off the English for long enough to make it actually be real, but that's its place in our documents.
In our history.
Yeah.
But there's nothing about that holds our government to any particular practice.
Well, the part about consent of the governed.
You're grasping. These papers provide us zero protection. You have to have somebody willing to do great violence to hold people to what the paper says.
Yes.
Because if you try to open your beauty salon in Dallas right now and hold the Constitution up, they'll shoot your dog and put you in jail.
Yeah, I'm nodding.
I love Chesterton I love his commentary here, but it's 1922 America, and I don't even live there anymore. I mean, it's not the same place. The whole damn thing, well, it pleased me, but also made me very sad because a lot of the things that he's talking about and a lot of the predictions he makes and a lot of the bad eventualities that he sees that could happen have happened. And that weighed on me the whole time I read it.
Yeah, so it's 1922. It's the beginning of Prohibition, which is an unbelievable imposition on the rights of people. Can you imagine not being able to go get a beer? Like being able to get one your entire life and then not being able to get one. This is what we did. I love the Declaration of Independence. I love what it says.
Yeah.
If people roll over, then it doesn't matter what it says. That's certainly true. I would like, gosh, I wish people would read the thing. I wish they would know what the idea was that we were founded on and value it. And it's not, all right, I really like the Republic. I don't like the Republic. This is Plato's Republic.
Okay, there you go.
I don't like it for the shape of that state that they make. If you worked it out, it'd be a lot like the state that Big Brother has in 1984 in practice. I'm not sure Plato meant it to be taken that way. I think it's a bit of a comic work, but that's a long story. But one thing that I really like is in Book 1, when Thrasymachus puts forth the question, he says, well, he makes a statement. He says, justice is nothing other than the will of the stronger. And Socrates ties him up in a few verbal twists, but nobody's really convinced. You know, everybody lives, wherever you live, if you look around, justice is the will of the stronger. Well, what are you going to do with that? Are you just going to take it? And then I guess you have to make yourself the stronger. You have to join the dominant political party. You got to, play the game. You have to, I would say, corrupt yourself. And then you can have power, and then you can do what you want as long as you don't step outside their structures. Or there is such a thing as justice that you can appeal to that is so compelling that rational people will see it too. And if that's the case, then perhaps you could have a state that was founded on more than just the application of force. That was the ideal of the founding. At least that's what Jefferson said. Who knows if Jefferson believed it, but that's what he said.
It's such a cop-out to say that, or to speculate that somebody didn't mean what they wrote. Mm-hmm. Just read it and just take it for what it is and then argue what the person wrote. Who cares? Like, what if he lied through his teeth and wrote all that? It doesn't matter.
He signed it.
Right.
And they all
else
signed it. And they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor.
Right.
So
good enough.
Yeah.
That's the creed he talks about. And so he says that the United States wasn't founded on racial preferences or even religious preferences, but in that it was founded on that idea, it's the nation with the soul of a church. Because for him, he says it's based on a belief. Later on, I think he steps on his shoelaces a little bit when he talks about how Americans are a nation, a people with a particular sense of humor and a particular energy, though there may be some sort of a cousin to the Englishman or a distinct thing, separate of that Declaration of Independence creed that was put forth. He goes on longer about that than he does this idea.
Yep. If you were going to found a nation on a creed, it's got to manifest in a type of people. As I may or may not have been evading the blockade to come down here, I was thinking, what do the people in this countryside that I'm driving through have to do with New York City? Is there any way in which they're the same people? And I don't think they are. The concerns are completely different. We speak the same language.
We speak the same language, and we have families, and we love other people, and we need food and shelter and stuff like that. But once you get past a certain level in Maslow's hierarchy, our pyramids look much different. What does self-actualization look like for a Texan versus a New Yorker? I think they're much different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, the tendency of all of us is to look at the people that live differently than we do, laugh at them, and then call them names.
I I told you and your wife this story last night or night before last, and I'll probably get in trouble for this. There was a meme going around Twitter, and it was a picture of some white trash, crappy house with an old broke down car in the front yard and a crappy couch on the front porch, and just think Appalachia or Adair County, Oklahoma. And the front yard is a Trump sign. And I saw this on Twitter, and it was kind of people on the left who were saying, well, how's that working out for you, your support for Trump?
Mm-hmm. That's a perfect example of what we're talking about.
These are the people that I come from. And they care so little about politics that they vote for the person who they think is most likely to leave them alone. They don't care about a nice house. They don't care about internet speed. All they care about is being left alone.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's real base. Sometimes it's, plenty of pork rinds and natural light beer. But all in all, it's about just being left the heck alone. There are people that do not understand that at all. And they look at that existence and think that's miserable. They would never want that for themselves or for anybody else they cared about. But I know those. Those people are my cousins. And they're just as happy as a pig in shit. They love it. They love it.
Yeah, we're going to do, this is a spoiler, we're going to do some Jimmy Rogers in a later podcast. And I'm listening to some of these songs about the railroad guy or the mule skinner. What does he say? I'm a do-right man. I got a home in every town.
Yep.
That's my grandfather. He worked on the train. He was a railroad guy, and he had a woman in every town. It can be kind of low, but these are, at least on one side of my family, these are my people too. I see pictures of, I've been to New York. I paid $15 for a scotch. Shocked. I bet it's $50 now.
Maybe, yeah.
And to me, that was very strange. I can't do it. I don't like it. Now, what would be the improper reaction if I would see these people living in the little pillboxes in New York, and I'd say, they're so horrible. This strikes me as wrong. These people are stupid and worthless and ought to be. Well, no, maybe I should try to understand why they think this is a good life. What they're seeing doesn't mean I have to agree with it eventually. It just means there's something they see there. I want to see a horizon. That's important to me. And right. I wouldn't like it. I don't care if I ever go see a Broadway show again. It's nice when I get to, but it's so bad to laugh at people and then sneer at people.
Yep.
Because once you sneer at them, you can shoot them.
Yeah. I'm getting a little tired of being sneered at over here in flyover country. I don't know. There haven't been very many people smarter than Chesterton. He was a great big heavy fellow. He enjoyed his good food. Mm-hmm. He enjoyed his drink. Seems like he enjoyed his cigar too. Mm-hmm. He had his tastes, but by no means snobbish. I really liked it. I think he's somebody I could have played dominoes with. He says that citizenship is the American ideal, but has never been the English ideal. And this book is as much about England as it is about America. He's constantly doing that juxtaposition. And I'd never really thought about what the English think of citizenship. They just had. They've been having this row over Brexit, and people have been voting, and votes have been, it's just been this whole weird wackadoo thing. They do have a different concept of what it means to be English or a member of the UK. You don't hear about citizenship.
You're a subject of the crown.
A subject of the crown, yeah.
Yeah.
And he says the king should be a president and the president should be a king, by the way.
Yeah. Nobody's ever mad at the king. They're mad at the parliament.
Yeah.
Because they know, if you can find the quote, you can dig it up. But he says, everybody knows that everyone's out to screw them. He doesn't use that word. But they know the king, who's powerless, is probably the last person in the nation that's able to cheat them. So when the king goes by, they're happy with the king. Queen Elizabeth, what has she ever done to anybody?
Yeah.
She can't.
Can't remember what his exact words are. Let's see if I can find it. Well, it's essentially that the role of the president in the United States is just to confound. I think he's right. The president has the veto power, Nobody else has that. I mean, courts kind of do, but he's got that veto power. He's just the focal point of everyone's ire and always is. And then people, we elect a president and then, 49% of people hate him. It's just the worst job in the world. The king's the good job. The King of England's the good job.
Yeah, so in a constitutional monarchy, you have a king who does nothing, but is the sovereign, but the executive is somebody else.
Yeah.
In the Meditation on Broadway, so let's just take a tour through some of these chapters. Meditation on Broadway, he meets some Bulgarian guy that's in New York who says to him, "From the earth we come and to the earth we return. When people get away from that, they're lost." And he's thinking about this person telling him this while he's walking through Times Square and seeing advertisements everywhere. He has a joke. As you're going through Times Square and seeing all of the advertisements, what a glorious garden of wonders this would be to anyone who was lucky enough to be unable to read.
Yeah. And he talks about how it's just festooned like a constellation. How awful is it that we have the ability to do that? You guys know what Times Square looks like. You got all the neon, and now it's LED lights and these big screens, and even then it was neon and lit up. And we take all that artistic ability and all that aesthetic power and use it to get you to buy washing powders. It's a damn shame,
Decorated like a cathedral. I've been actually doing this in my listening to popular music recently. I've been listening to a bunch of Spanish language stuff, and I don't know much Spanish. And so I've been listening to Jenny and the Mexicats, which is some English girl in a Mexican band. She sings mostly in Spanish. And then Monsieur Perinet, which is a Colombian jazz rock pop group. I like them. I never know what they're saying.
Fine.
So I get to listen to the music and enjoy the quality of the music without being distracted by, stupid lyrics. Am I breaking my own rule by calling the lyrics stupid?
Nope. There's some pretty dumb lyrics out there.
I always listen to lyrics, and I can't not listen to lyrics. But this lets me get away from it. This would be like walking through Times Square not knowing how to read English and seeing all the signs flashing and saying, how wonderful, how beautiful. Look at the colors. And not having to think they're selling me.
Seventh Heaven cigars is one that he mentioned.
But I think that word that Bulgarian waiter said to him might be a motto for Chesterton's, if we're going to talk about political thought. From the earth we come, and to the earth we return. When people get away from that, they are lost. He really likes the Middle West, which would be everything from New York to Oklahoma, I guess.
Yeah. We forget, I'm looking at my stupid phone, that everything that we have is, we use our intellect and we use our manpower. We use that to manipulate either mining products or agricultural products. Mm-hmm. So if you've got a computer or you're listening to us on an iPhone or an iPad or whatever the heck it is right now, somebody mined silica and aluminum and all kinds of ores, and then human labor and ingenuity went into that so that you could listen to this. Your phone is a refined mining product. The danger of these cosmopolitan areas, and he doesn't say it exactly like this, is that, being away from the earth makes people lose track of where all of this comes from and what the basis of life really is. Mm-hmm. And it's what you can scratch out of the ground or what seeds sprout. That's it.
I said in a previous show, I confessed that we do watch Hallmark movies in our house. Hallmark movies are full. The woman's usually the main character, and every single one of them is a food blogger. They have some sort of non-productive job working in media, or they're never making podcasts. That hasn't got the Hallmark yet. But it's some kind of really like deracinated profession that has nothing to do. And it's one of the plots that they'll do all the time is, she goes back to the country.
Right.
And she meets the guy who's actually working the farm.
Yeah, think of any rom-com you've ever seen. She's either edits a ladies magazine, she's a food blogger, she's an HR, a high-powered, fast-moving executive at an advertising agency, and she doesn't get the promotion she wants, or she does get it and then finds that it didn't fulfill her. She goes home for Christmas break because her dad died to be with her mother. And she meets the guy who didn't go to college that she thought was okay, but he's now an electrician. And he's got a lot more money than she thought he would. And he's the salt of the earth. And when he finds her dog hurt, he takes the dog to the vet and pays the bill and he's just a stand-up guy.
I'm tearing up right now. I want to see this movie.
You like that? That's all of them. Hope Floats, Sweet Home Alabama, name them. It's all of them.
I was thinking Love Actually, but I'm not sure how that fits.
I haven't seen that one.
Well, it's English, so maybe it doesn't count. But so the reason they are all that way is
lots of pencil skirts too.
Yeah, well, they're pointing to something in human nature. We're in the room together. He's laughing at me because you can see my face. I'm not in my dark room. But all of those silly things that still move us, they move us because it appeals to something, I would say, of human nature. And we can very easily forget. Chesterton says somewhere that the influence of the cities is bad. It needs to be counterbalanced by the influence of the farms, of the peasantry. He says somewhere in here, let's see, monarchies and peasantries can last forever, but wage earners, who knows? I have to dig up the actual quote.
How about this one? What is the matter with the modern world is the modern world, and the cure will come from another.
Yeah.
The matter with the modern world is not modern headlines or modern films or modern machinery. What is the matter with the modern world is the modern world.
It might be true. What if it's true? What are you going to do about it?
It only talks about progress and how there's a faith of optimism. It's like a religion of optimism that whatever is next is the right thing, and that whatever was the wrong thing, and we've moved past it. And that's one of my problem with progress is we don't know towards what and for what reason, so that what will happen. So he's very skeptical of modernity. And he talks about Americans, being new, being a new nation. America is talked about as being young. And he talks about in what ways America is young. It's enthusiastic. It's naive. And he says it being young, it grasps the new thing more quickly than other nations do. And as soon as they grasp the new thing, they forget the old thing. It's almost like once you learn to ride a bicycle, you forget how to walk. That's a big danger that he sees, being our 20th century de Tocqueville, that he sees the problem with America.
Yeah. I want to get back to that thing on progress. I was just digging up a quote when you were talking. It's talking about progress and profits. He's talking about prohibition. How's this for a good quote? The same American atmosphere that permits prohibition permits of people being punished for kissing each other.
Mm-hmm.
Well, prohibition was very progressive. People used to go to saloons. I've read some books on this. The saloon was like when Bertie Wooster goes to the club. I was going to say gentleman's club, but it doesn't mean the same thing it did then. But we'd go to the Drones Club, wherever he went, and meet with his friends. This is what the saloons were, but perhaps for the lower class of people. Well, that's no good. They're not at home. They're drinking too much.
If they have fun and drink too much, they won't be productive workers.
They won't be productive workers, and we need to make productive workers. So getting rid of alcohol is helpful to somebody.
The plutocrats, he comes back to America, and he says there isn't a day that goes by that he doesn't hear someone in America say something about the almighty dollar. Mm-hmm. He said the English never talk about the pound.
The almighty pound.
And he said that Americans use it as an explanation for everything. Well, the almighty dollar. That pursuit of the dollar as a measure of a man, not of price, but of accomplishment, of drive, of energy, just scares the crap out of him. Me too. Mm-hmm. It's led to this plutocracy.
Yeah, let me go a little further on this. The truth is that prohibitions might have done far less harm as prohibitions if a vague association had not arisen on some dark day of human unreason. I love that. Between prohibition and progress. The prohibition became considered to be progress. And it was progress that did the harm, not the prohibition. Men can enjoy life under considerable limitations if they can be sure of their limited enjoyments, but under progressive Puritanism, we can never be sure of anything. The curse of it is not limitation, it is unlimited limitation. The evil is not in the restriction, but in the fact that nothing can ever restrict the restriction. If a restriction on behavior serves the cause of progress or protection of the common good or whatever, progressing towards some future which has no shape, what are we progressing towards? No one can ever give you an answer to that. So there's never a limit to the amount of infringements that could be put on you to get you to that unshapen progressive dream. If restricting alcohol consumption is good, well, why not restricting smoking? Why not restrict BMI?
No, but we can't be doing that.
Now,
what's your BMI?
It's like 70.
Yeah, mine's 62, enormous. I think.
It's enormous. He calls it, the progressives he calls prophets. They've got a faith in a future. He calls it an inversion of ancestor worship. Their superstition is an inversion of the ancestor worship of China. Instead of vainly appealing to something that is dead, they appeal to something that may never be born. Some glorious future that nobody knows the shape of it. That is the justification for all sorts of actions in the present.
So this prohibition thing, he makes all these wonderful arguments against the prohibition of drinking of alcohol, and I buy it. Well, we've kind of already lost. I say we, dear listener, you and I, listener, have already lost the marijuana thing. Apparently, I think marijuana usage now is decriminalized or legal in probably most states. I don't really follow it very closely, but it's just all but legal for everyone for any purpose in Oklahoma at this point. Mm-hmm. So that prohibition's over.
They are essential businesses in Illinois.
Yeah. And he makes an argument. I've been looking for this quote and I can't find it, that the use of alcohol was cultural and traditional. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons that he would let something like that be legal is that it had this long tradition and this long cultural significance. The libertarian argument that, well, you just let people ingest whatever plants they want because you don't have the right to use violence against them for ingesting whatever plant that they want. Mm-hmm. That sounds good. That sounds good on the face of it. But traditionally, I was protected from having to deal with stoners. I don't really have a problem with marijuana, but I have a problem with stoners. I don't really want to make marijuana illegal, but I want to make stoners illegal. and hey, maybe I'm not philosophically sound here.
Yeah, you consistently oppose prohibition of alcohol and oppose the decriminalization of marijuana?
Do I contradict myself?
You contain multitudes.
Right.
Let me make a case for it. So your thought about it being an imposition of a new thing on a settled culture is an interesting thought. If I, growing up, I met a guy from my grade school. This is probably 20 years ago. And I hadn't seen him in a long time. And we were chatting, and he's talking about another friend of ours who had been out in Gulf War the First and showed up on TV demonstrating how to fire Patriot missiles. And he said to me, I can't believe our friend Joe, who I used to go smoke pot with behind the grade school, showing off Patriot missiles on TV. And I looked at, you guys smoked pot behind a grade school? I had no idea. Whatever was the circle that did that things, it was pretty far removed from me. It wasn't presented to me as a possibility of action.
Yeah, it was probably a lot like the drinking was. Like, he says, Chesterton says, well, if you got enough money, you can drink under prohibition. Like if you were willing to maybe get a ticket, maybe do a night in jail, if you were willing to deal with some trouble, maybe weed was part of your world. But I'll tell you, it was never a part of my world at all until 5 or 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. And there's probably somebody saying that, where the hell does he live and what kind of sand does he have his head buried in? I'm telling you, not part of my world at all. And now I have to drive up and down the highway, and there are signs. It's not really the Marlboro Man or Drink Canada Dry billboards, but there are billboards advertising marijuana products to my children everywhere we go.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody's right to, ingest a plant. Okay, maybe. Where's my right to not have to talk about that stuff with my kids every time we get in the car to go to dinner? What would Chesterton say?
Chesterton might say it's necessary to make distinctions on just what alcohol is and just what marijuana is. And I would draw, I don't know where he says this. I've read so much Chesterton, all the quotes are floating around in my head. But he thinks it would be sinful to drink beyond the point when you lose reason. And his test for it is you can drink until you can no longer compose poetry in praise of drink.
Sounds like a good rule. The problem with stoners is they think all their verse is awesome. They would never know. There's nobody more boring to be around than somebody that's high.
Well, they would need somebody next to them. Was that a good poem? You're good. Have another.
Yeah, I found that quote I was talking about. He said, I am content here to note that a man's treatment of his own body in relation to traditional and ordinary opportunities for bodily excess is as near to his self-respect as social coercion can possibly go. And that when that is gone, there's nothing left. So he doesn't want people to extend this to dancing, kissing, tobacco, and so on. But I think that if I'm being an attorney here, his use of traditional and ordinary opportunity for bodily excess is the distinction between a libertarian fantasy where everything goes. Yeah.
Way back when we read Gabriel Marcel, he talked about we get technology before we get the virtues to deal with it.
Right.
And if you have an imposition, I think it's an imposition of freely available marijuana everywhere. Well, do we have the virtues to deal with it? There were virtues about smoking back when I grew up. You didn't just drop your ash on the floor. You asked people's permission.
Marlboro can't put billboards up anymore. There are no Jack Daniels billboards or advertisements and things like that. There's all kinds of controls on those sorts of things. But every dingbat dispensary in Tulsa, Oklahoma has got a billboard as big as a semi-truck.
Well, for some reason, marijuana's progressive, but tobacco's not.
Right.
And Jack Daniels isn't.
Is alcohol a soporific? Is marijuana a soporific?
I've never had it. I don't know. Are they going to write in and make? We're going to have to do. We're going to have to do a Joe Rogan, Elon Musk thing where we.
Oh God, I'm not messing with any of that shit.
No thanks. I don't want to either.
I don't like being altered.
Yeah,
even when I drink my beloved bourbon, I do not like to be drunk.
No,
at all.
Takes me half an hour to get through like this much.
Yeah,
I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, I drink it because it's delicious. I don't drink it for its effects because the effects can be had much more inexpensively than that bottle of crap. What was it that Melissa and I drank last night?
Rhetoric. Yeah,
24-year-old bourbon.
Yeah. There are cheaper ways to get
bit.
Yeah, and the quote you read, I think that's a reasonable barrier that you don't want. If progressivism can get into your body.
Bill Gates wants in your body with his vaccine.
If progressivism can get into your body, what do you have left? Where is it that you can be yourself and can live your life as you like? Which I suppose you could flip and say, make an argument for marijuana, fine. Maybe you can. That's different from the billboards everywhere and them being an essential service. I don't understand it.
Our liquor stores barely have signage in Oklahoma. And on one hand, there's not a lot of liberty for liquor store owners because they can't put up signs like Arby's. But I don't fucking care. It's not all about them, and not all these victimless crimes are in fact victimless. They change the material conditions of the world that I was born into. I think I have a property right in the society that I was born into. I was born in 1974. My mom and dad made a decision that it was okay to have a kid at that time. And the world was like it was. It was X. Everything they do that changes those material conditions treads on that property right I think that I have. And they continue to do it. And his test here about tradition in terms of the alcohol prohibition is what he's all about. He thinks that the tradition exists for a reason. He thinks that people are wonderful, they're smart, they know something about the soil and the world that they live in, and that their traditions have emerged over thousands of years to give them the best chance at the good life.
Yeah, well, there's a story he tells, it must be in Orthodoxy, it was referenced yesterday, about the fence. If you have a bunch of kids playing inside of a fence, do you take the fence down? Not unless you know why the fence is there.
Right.
So that's a metaphor for traditions. He does the same thing. He talks about, in his more religious writings, he'll talk about liturgical reform. And so if you look at the hugely encrusted Tridentine Latin liturgy, which would have been the Catholic liturgy at the time, and you say, well, we don't need this. You point to some litany in it. Well, you don't know why it was there in the first place.
Right.
So if you take it out, you might break the whole thing. Maybe you think about it for
a few hundred years.
Yeah, a few hundred years. And then if you understand it, you can get rid of it. But the smash and dash way of dealing with culture, you don't know why it was there.
Yeah, he says that this tradition for him is a crucial test. He's Burkean in this way. Mm-hmm. He believes that the tradition exists for a reason, and if the thing that you propose runs contrary to tradition, you are in risk of doing something terrible. And he says that progressivism, he says it never synthesizes and adds; it slices and dices and atomizes, and removes. Does making marijuana usage legal slice and dice? It atomizes. I think it takes people farther away from their origins. Mm-hmm. It has effects on relationships. You know, if you've got 5 kids and they pass a new law that says marijuana is legal, you say to yourself, do I want one of these kids smoking marijuana every day for the rest of their lives?
No, I don't.
No.
But there's going to be people selling it to them for the rest of their lives.
For the rest of their
every
lives.
day.
If they're never going to do it, they have to be perfect every minute, every day for the rest of their days.
There'll be targeted ads in every bit of social media they go on. They need social media distancing. We're getting a little far from Chesterton, but I don't really think it is. I don't know. There's a mutual friend of ours who told me that he really liked the show, and I appreciate that. And he said, I don't always agree with you. And I said, that's all right.
Right.
You know? So if we're firing you up and you're like, I'm all for marijuana.
Go eat an edible. If I made you mad, go eat one of your edibles.
It's okay. Look, we're talking. We believe in the power of reason, okay? So if you can make a rational argument, that's fine. Refute me. Come at me, bro. That's all right. It's okay. We're just talking.
He's anti-capitalist.
He's anti-capitalist. He's pro-nation. Mm-hmm. I wanted to chat about that for a little bit.
Can we do capitalism first?
We can do whatever you want.
Pro-nation's good, too. Page 127 in the Kindle edition I got, Karl. He says, capitalism was never anything so human as a habit. We may say it was never anything so good as a bad habit. It was never a custom, for men never grew accustomed to it. It was never even conservative, for before it was even created, wise men had realized that it could not be conserved. It was from the first a problem, and those who will not even admit the capitalist problem deserve to get the Bolshevist solution. All things considered, I cannot say anything worse of them than that. I think he's wrong about that. I don't think he's wrong about the nature. I don't think he's wrong about the consequences of American-style capitalism, where the capital all aggregates. We're watching it right now. You end up with a plutocracy, where our public health policy is being influenced by a guy who stole an operating system in the early 80s. It's the weirdest thing in the world. But I've been thinking about capitalism a lot, and I think it's inevitable. Anywhere that you have a rational person that cares about their work, you're going to have somebody that's doing a better job and improving the craft and becoming more productive and getting more ears of corn per acre. Mm-hmm. Capitalism follows. It's a product of rationality.
Well, we ought to define terms here. What is capitalism?
Well, capitalism is use of capital, which would be land, money, or people.
Money and debt, I would say.
Well, okay. To pursue a profit. Chesterton is not a communist, but he wants that ownership that he wants that ownership to be private and at the smallest possible level, which is at the individual or family level. I'll put some words in his mouth. I think that he would hate the common stock company, stuff on the New York Stock Exchange. He would hate corporate personhood, and that as a distributist, he would say that government policy needs to be made to help people own their own means. He doesn't want you to be a plumber that fixes bathrooms full-time for American Airlines. He wants you to own your own plumbing truck and have your own small business. He wants you to be a smallholder and do your own farming. He wants you to apply your own craft with your own tools and have the biggest possible stake in your own success and failures. He doesn't like this aggregation that happens, particularly when there's all the debt and the usury and financialization of collateralized debt obligations and all this weird financial chicanery that we have going on now was a natural conclusion from what he was seeing in the 20s. But if you use capital to increase productivity and to obtain a profit, and the profit is just the value that is the difference in the inputs that you as a business owner have in a product versus what it is worth to the person who bought it. So if it's worth more to them than it costs you, you make a profit. And so if you're rational and you care about what you do, you can do things at a lower cost, do them more effectively, make them more efficiently than the other guy who doesn't care about that thing or doesn't specialize in that thing. So the profit's a natural consequence of it. I make bows and arrows, and you grow corn, and you're better at it than I am, then you make a profit.
Okay, but now what you do, so you make bows and arrows. Well, that's a problem because you've got weapons and I just have corn.
You can trade arrows for corn one way or another.
You could, but now you've got I have a bad harvest, and you loan me money, and now I'm in debt to you, and I have a charge on my property every year that goes up, that goes up, that goes up, and now you own my farm. You didn't do anything to own it. I think this is what we're talking about with capitalism and trusts and things getting bigger and bigger. He's got a line in here, I needed to look it up, about Andrew Carnegie. I always said Carnegie, but Carnegie, hiring gunmen to put down protesters. And I knew Rockefeller did that. I didn't know Carnegie did that. Yep. I have to look up. That's the thing. Whenever we travel, we'll go visit Carnegie libraries, which are these nice little libraries that he donated to all these towns. But he's shooting union people. Earning a profit is not the capitalism that he's talking about. I think he'd be all in favor of that. In fact, he is. It's the allocation of everything into one enormous conglomerate. He laments, it was almost like it was written last week, he laments that England has lost its agriculture. It's a national security issue. They don't have their own agriculture.
Yeah, he actually says that, that they cannot grow all of their own food is a national security problem.
So, gosh, I'm not a communist, but I think that's a real problem.
Wanting people to own their own businesses and to actually own their property outright is not communist.
Right. So I have, back when we were allowed to have gyms in person, and I would chat with this young man who's got a pharmacy degree and student debt. And, my gut feeling is don't forgive student debt. They knew what they signed up for.
They're fraudulent loans, though.
But what I'm thinking, I'm looking at this kid. He's a kid. He's in his 20s. He's not married. He's not going to start a family. He can't. He's got debt. Mm-hmm. It's completely contrary to any sort of settled good life.
His future earnings are already pledged.
Yeah.
And so he can't give them to a wife and children. He has to give them to Sally Mae, Student Loan Servicing Company.
Yeah. So we don't have slavery now. Hooray. Except we do.
Yeah. Chesterton says in this book that the industrialization is way worse than the slavery was.
It's open to debate, sure, but
because that people get a wage and they're treated okay, that it's not seen for what it is. In that respect, it's worse than the slavery that we had in the 19th century, I think is what he's saying. Mm-hmm. And these plutocrats in the 1920s and today even, are conspiring around the clock to, in this case, get rid of alcohol. They don't want you to have fun. They don't want you to come into work a little hungover, and they want the total work economy. And, everybody's getting to work from home right now. Just wait. Just wait. You're going to have to wear a Fitbit. It's coming. I'll make my prediction in public. You're going to get a Fitbit and a phone app, and if you're supposed to be working between the hours of whatever and whatever, and you move and get up from your chair more than X number of times, your Fitbit's going to tell the boss, and he's going to get on to you about it. They're already finding out that people are more productive from home. They're not going to have you back at the office. They don't have to buy toilet paper for you now, right? You can buy your own toilet paper. You're not chatting up Susan and causing HR troubles, the two of you. So that's cheaper. That's awesome. And they're going to be listening to you. If your kids come up to you and ask you questions or talk to you too much during the workday, it's going to be total work. Total work.
Yep. And what would stop it? Because there's no natural limit on progressivism.
No, there's no limit. Oh, I happen to know that you had about a 45-minute commute one way, and you worked 9 to 5, but you had to leave the house at 8. So we're just going to change your work hours to 8 to 6 because you weren't able to be at home during those hours before anyway.
Yeah, we're going to have to ask you to come in on Sunday, fill in your TPS reports, and
your house is their fucking office now. It's going to be great, guys. It's a brave new world.
So maybe, I want to talk a bit more about the notion of slavery and wage slavery. So there's a line in here: even Southern slavery had this one moral merit. Hold your fire. That it was decadent. It has this one historic advantage, that it is dead. The Northern slavery, industrial slavery, or what is called wage slavery, is not decaying but increasing, and the end of it is not yet. There's no end in sight. If the gig economy that, everybody's working 5 independent contractor jobs, and, when I was a kid, the dads had a job. This is in the 70s. Might be in a factory. They'd worked there 40 years. They get their gold watch. They'd retire. They would have had a good life. They were richer. Now, they didn't have iPhones, but their houses didn't cost as much. They didn't necessarily have to have 2 people work. It was pretty unusual when I was a kid to have both parents work. So you go home and your mom would be there.
Your dad didn't want to go to work. They would do it because we had good dads. But we've since then been taught that everybody wants to go to work and everyone wants to have a career. Yeah. When did that happen? Like when I was a kid, every older guy would say, listen, son, you're not going to be on your deathbed wishing you'd worked more. But now they tell everybody, get a job, fight to keep it, work on your career. I don't understand.
There's no natural limit to that. What's the limit is, we had a wonderful little chat on our Slack thing about whether the ultimate value is life in this current epidemic that we're having. People are doing all sorts of extraordinary and I think destructive things just to support the mere continuation of life. Well, is that the goal, or is it a certain kind of life? Wage slavery, more productivity. Why? What's the end state? Well, the end state should be, I think, a reasoned understanding of what a human life is. And a human life is not working like a dog, making the GDP go up for the plutocrats.
Input. You're not just a manufacturing input.
Right.
Can we talk about the Irish?
You could talk about the Irish.
The Irish problem. They had just had this is written in 1922, and Chesterton's an Englishman, and
first person that greets him is an Irishman.
First person that greets him is an Irish
in America,
an Irishman journalist who interviews him, and he quite enjoyed the interview. But Belfast is still smoking. It's 1922, and Ireland is separated, and scary times. And in the United States at this time, is the Northeast is overrun with Irishmen. It changed the political nature of the country. The Northeast started, and he talks about this, that the Northeast was born of the Puritans, who were, Chesterton says, they were not freedom-loving people. They were absolutists. They would put you on the dunking stool and put you in the stocks and make you wear the scarlet A, and were the opposite of religious tolerant folk, or folk tolerant of various religions, and very straight-laced Puritans. Puritanical. That's where the word comes from. So you end up with a particular kind of white shoe Boston aristocracy, of a particular kind of politics that come out of the Northeast. So you can see the arguments between the Adamses and the more conservative folk in the Northeast versus the folks in Tidewater, Virginia. They're from the Cavalier stock, the squire of the South. By the time Chesterton arrives, the potato famines have already happened. There's been an enormous exodus of Irish to the Northeast and completely changed the political environment up there. This makes Chesterton reflect on the British treatment of the Irish and how poorly the British have done empire.
Mm-hmm.
He says nobody impugns France for their annexation and overrun of Brittany because they were so successful. It's just France now. But the British were tolerant of Irishness to the degree that they never made them become English. They never assimilated them. And Ireland separated. And he doesn't say this outright, but under all of his writings in this book anyway, I think he wonders, how are these Americans going to keep all this together?
Yeah, so I'm armed with quote here.
Uh-oh.
Nobody knows if this is going to last. Slaveries could last and peasantries could last, but wage-earning communities could hardly even live and were already dying. What's the guarantee that our current state is going to endure? You might argue that, well, it's been 100 years since this book was written, 98 years.
Middle class is gone, though, largely, since this has happened.
The thing about the Irish, if you had been able to... He says something about Lincoln. He thinks that Lincoln was right in one thing, that the United States was one nation and not two. And the evidence that he was right is that there's no more resistance. That people think of themselves as Americans and not as Confederates or Northerners.
Well, he's 57 years out from the end of the war, too.
Yeah. So that's giving you a thought that a nation is a people. So it's a little bit different from the idea in the beginning of the book that it's a creed.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a people. And it's got to have its own unity in order to last. And so the worry about the Irish is, well, we never had any unity. And he makes some jokes about them. They used to say the Saxon can always rule the Celt. Well, the Celts all moved to America and ruled America.
Yeah.
So exhibit would be the Kennedy family, for example. Right. Which is true. I mean, the Irish came to America and they set themselves up. They did very well.
Yeah, what else are they going to do?
Some of my ancestors, one fourth of my ancestors, actually. Are you Irish?
Not that I'm aware of. Everybody acts like they are.
Well, on St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, he talks about the Irish problem in America. But I mentioned this on the Barbell Logic podcast that came out this morning, that Aristotle in his book, in Politics, Book 5, it's all about revolution. Book 5 is about revolution. And for Aristotle, revolution isn't necessarily just hanging somebody from a lamppost or, violent overthrow of government. He says anything that you do that changes the nature of the government is revolutionary. Duh. So if you change who can vote, the way votes come out is going to be different. And by, you will end up with a different kind of government. So the most common kind of revolution is changing who gets citizenship or who gets the franchise. And in the United States, that has happened over and over and over again. You used to have property to have the franchise, then you didn't. Then they had Emancipation Proclamation, and then the slaves were allowed to, former slaves were allowed to vote, and then the women got the vote, and then we took in an enormous number of European, typically mostly Irish and Italian immigrants who then were given the franchise, and on and on and on. So he talks about women's suffrage in particular, and he wanted to debate a public figure. He names a lot of people, and I don't know who the heck they are. Time has passed, and they didn't hold up like Chesterton did. But he said that this great and glorious demagogue had degenerated into a statesman. He wanted to debate this guy, but he refused. The gentleman refused. And he said, I'd never expected for a moment that the great orator could be bothered to debate with me at all, but it never occurred to me as a general moral principle that two educated men were forever forbidden to talk sense about a particular topic because a lot of other people had already voted on it.
Well, yeah, I thought that was funny, too, that it's been decided you can't talk about it anymore. Progress doesn't have an end point. All it has is continual motion. And once you've moved, you can't go back. You can't talk about it. There's no point in talking about it because we've moved on. We've moved on from there.
That's not who we are, Karl.
Right. We're not that anymore. I don't know what we are or where we're going, but...
He says, we are perpetually being told in the papers that what we wanted is a strong man who will do things. What is wanted is a strong man who will undo things. And that'll be a real test of strength, he says.
Yeah, I wonder what he thought of Coolidge. This is before Coolidge.
Yeah.
That would be a strong man who didn't do anything.
Right.
I want to talk a little bit about nations. He has some interesting things to say, and he's upset. He doesn't think anyone's done the right job for his own nation. Talking about how to relate. I want to give a couple of quotes, and maybe we can talk about them. Nations ought to love nations like men love women, not because they're the same, but because they're different.
Yep.
So, rather than trying to make the Irish be Englishmen who live on the island next door, you let the Irish be whoever they are, and you find what's lovable about Irishness. I suppose nations needs poets. I want to read the quote here. Men who wish to interest us in Arabs did not confine themselves to saying that they are monotheists or moralists. They filled our romances with the rush of Arab steeds or the colors of strange tents or carpets. What we want is somebody to do for the Englishman with his front garden what was done for the Jap, that's his word, not mine, and his paper house, who shall understand the Englishman with his dog as well as the Arab with his horse. In a word, what nobody has really tried to do is the one thing that really wants doing. It's to make England attractive as a nationality and even as a small nationality. What is it about Englishness that's good? And like in 4 hours, we're going to be talking Jimmy Rogers. What is it about that particular branch of American culture that is neat? We were listening to it last night. Like, this is really good stuff. This is gangster stuff.
Yeah.
You know?
It is. I took my family to England 3 years ago. I don't know when it was. 4 years ago.
They let you in?
They let me in. It is not America. Seems plain. But, you know, that we both speak English. Americans were... George Washington probably had an English accent, you know? His folks had come here 75 years before the war.
I think England probably used to have a Southern accent.
Well, there's that. There's a lot of talk that says that because England has such proximity to Europe and the Southern United States didn't have that our accent is more like the Southern accent, probably the Carolinas in particular would have been more like what
so Shakespeare should be done with a drawl.
Yeah. But I mean, it is an entirely different nation, and there's a lot very wonderful about it. London is quiet. They're an introverted people. There's not loud talking. If you get on an escalator, everyone stands on one side. So if you're in a hurry, you can march up the escalator and not have anybody block your way. The underground's quiet. You know, nobody's blaring music. There's not a lot of horn honking. It's, you know, they're introverted, quiet people. I think it's lovely. They love their enclosed garden in the front, their big breakfasts, and they're their own thing. You know, we have piss everybody off. There are people that say that we don't have a culture. And I think that's what Chesterton is saying about Englishmen. Are like, well, we don't have a culture. They're not proud of it. Nobody's identified what it is. But you're like a fish in the fishbowl. It's just the water you swim in. You take it for granted. You don't understand how different you are, from how different we are in Oklahoma from people that were born in Toronto. You know.
Well, and what you end up doing is you say everybody else has a neat culture and they're all valuable, but we're not.
Right.
Well, no, they have neat cultures and they're valuable, but so are you.
Yeah, everybody is. And that's why I hate Applebee's.
That's why I love country music. How's that for a twofer?
Yeah.
Applebee's versus country music?
I don't like how homogenous everything is becoming. Food service has become industrialized. He's talking about that. He doesn't talk about that part, but industrialization means that, hand craftsmanship goes away. Uniformity of product comes in, and, local cuisines are dying. Oklahoma was settled in between, maybe the 1830s to the 1890s, and a lot of Germans, a lot of Czechs. Our chicken fried steak is a beef schnitzel.
Yes.
But they didn't make schnitzel in Germany with beef. It was pork, maybe a done at chicken, but we're going to be pork. But we had beef here. So we end up having this thing that they didn't have. But we just take it for granted, and that's just poor people food, and who cares? It's fucking delicious, But big chain stores, big chain restaurants stamp out, local cuisine. I read Ulysses S. Grant's memoir many years ago. One of the things I remember most about that is he talked about, I think he was from Ohio, Southern Illinois, maybe.
Eventually Illinois.
Yeah. When he went to West Point, it was right at the very, very beginning of train services and locomotives in the United States. And he said that almost everybody was incomprehensible because their accents were so thick and so different. And then he said by the time the war had started, trains and transportation had sped up everything so much and mixed everybody up so much that those regional dialects were going away. And I hate that.
Well, it's probably somewhat inevitable, but what I don't like about it is people not thinking that where they came from is valuable.
Right.
It's your stuff. I had a student once that we had a good relationship. He's a smart kid. He's from a different background from me, certainly. But he said, Mr. Shooter, whatever you call me, I forget. Filial piety is real important to you. And I hadn't really noticed.
Yeah, it is.
But is.
You're like Aeneas.
Yes, I agreed. That's right. I think it is. We'd been talking about the Aeneid, where Aeneas drags his father on his shoulders out of the city.
Have we ever talked about that, where I said you were like Aeneas? And then...
I don't think so.
Yeah, that's funny.
But, where you came from, that makes you who you are. And if there's anything of value in you, that means that there's something valuable in your upbringing and the people you came from. And it doesn't mean everything was perfect.
No.
But it means you probably ought to find the good stuff in it.
It's not perfect in France.
No. So, I treasure the stories. My dad sometimes listens to the podcast, but I like all the stories he talks about. Just telling stories, going out to the farm. I've been to that farm. We don't own it anymore. I wish we did. The homestead that my great-grandfather had in Lena, Illinois. Beautiful. But he would go out there, and his grandmother would have an apple pie for him. Just German immigrants coming in and setting up their farm. And that's why we always said Gesundheit. I never knew what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the only German we had. My grandmother's Irish and was a terrible cook. Horrible, horrible cook.
Boil everything until it submits.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. My mom's people have all sorts of interesting things about them.
American apple pie is a strudel with more productive fruit orchards.
Yeah. It
is. And so we've got our own thing here, and it's good. I want people to quit shitting on it.
Right.
How about that? Hey, and if you're somewhere else, your thing's pretty good too, but it's entirely different. Even
if it's New York City.
Yeah. They get super hot about their pizza versus the Chicago, weird upside down lasagna you guys have.
Well, it used to be block by block.
Yeah.
In Chicago in the old days, the way you would tell where somebody was from, at least if it was, it was a big chunk of Catholics in Chicago, but what's your parish? Little Flower, St. Leo, whatever. You would be known by which parish you were in the city, which little church community you belonged to. Maybe you didn't even go to church, but that was your parish.
Right.
Regionalism. Maybe someday you ought to read Napoleon of Notting Hill, which is another Chesterton book. It's a science fiction book set in 1984 about regionalism, and I don't know, it's funny. He does write fiction, by the way. The Father Brown mysteries are his. We've talked about him before. They're not Sherlock Holmes. You'll be able to figure out who the murderer is because he's got bad metaphysics.
Right. I like how Chesterton treasures all these different nations. Even the hairy Ainu.
What is a hairy Ainu? Did you look it up?
I didn't, because I know that the indigenous people of the northern Ireland or the northern islands of Japan are the Ainus.
Are they hairy?
Maybe. I assume that's who he's talking about. I'll look it up. Ainu. But he likes what everybody's got to offer, and he traveled the world when it was hard to do that. And was a very thoughtful observer of people, to the point that he had his own methods for observing. And he goes, the first 30 pages of the book are really about, how to observe different cultures and how to take them for what they are and see them with clean eyes. I love that about him. Should we talk about his Oklahoma expedition?
Yes, of course.
He goes to Oklahoma, which is the newest of the new.
I was trying to imagine Oklahoma in 1922.
Yeah. It was the newest of the new. We statehood in 1907. He shows up there and everything's new. And he meets a crazy man. You should probably talk about the crazy man, because I think I knew the guy.
I was trying to find the reference. It was some guy who had all sorts of buttons up and down his vest. And he saw Chesterton walking through the town, and he came up to him and he said something like, "I can tell you're part of the upper 10. Never explained what it meant.
He has all these little silver emblems and dangly medals hanging on his vest that are like stars and moons and things like that.
Shall I read the description?
Yeah,
I was strolling down the main street of the city and looking in at a paper stall vivid with the news of a crime, when a stranger addressed me and asked me quite politely, but with a curious air of having authority to put the question, what I was doing in that city. He was a lean brown man, having rather the look of a shabby tropical traveler, with a gray mustache and a lively and alert eye. But the most singular thing about him was that the front of his coat was covered with a multitude of shining metallic emblems made in the shape of stars and crescents. I was well accustomed by this time to Americans adorning the lapels of their coats with little symbols of various societies. It's part of the American passion for the ritual of comradeship. There's nothing that an American likes so much as to have a secret society and to make no secret of it." And what are you doing? "Well, I'm lecturing." To which he replied without restraint, but rather with an expansive and radiant pride, "I also am lecturing. I am lecturing on astronomy."
He's so generous. He says, that makes sense. He says, entomologists should bedazzle their waistcoats with spiders and cockroaches, and the conchologist, a simple costume of shells. An osteopath should be dressed to resemble a skeleton. He loves this idea.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. "And then came another turn of the wheel of topsy-turvydom, and all the logic was scattered to the wind. Expanding his starry bosom and standing astraddle, with the air of one who owned the street, the strange being continued, 'Yes, I am lecturing on astronomy, anthropology, archaeology, paleontology, embryology, eschatology, and so on, in a thunderous roll of theoretical sciences, apparently beyond the scope of any single university, let alone of any single professor.'" What a perfect character.
Yeah, a little later, he says, it's a pleasure to welcome here a fellow member of the upper 10. What? And then he flashes him a badge and disappears later.
The badge of the upper 10. What are the upper 10?
I want in.
Do we have Oklahoma City listeners? I want to know if they know about the upper 10.
But I knew a guy kind of like this.
Yeah?
When I was going to the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma, there used to be, we called it an insane asylum. In Norman, there were 3 or 4 state institutions that were closed down in the late 80s, and the people that were housed there were just forced out in their communities. And there was a guy that had been a resident there who found a way to live in town, and he would come into my favorite tavern, O'Connell's, at closing time, and the innkeeper let him tell everybody it was last call for alcohol and all that stuff, And he would wear a stack of baseball caps. We called him 3-Hat Willie, but he never wore 3. He would wear like 12.
12-Hat Willie.
Or 6. 3-Hat Willie. His name was Willie. And he carried a bicycle. He carried a walking stick with a bicycle horn on it, like Harpo Marx. And I would sit at the bar, and he would come up and sit down, and he was mentally handicapped in some way. I don't know what was wrong with the guy. What was different about him, but he would say, "Hey, How they treating you over at that job? I'd say, good. He'd say, how's your lady? She's all right. Is the car still running good? Yeah, it didn't run anymore. He says, job okay right now? Like, he had listened to people talk to each other in the bar, and he had picked up all of these things that people say in small talk, but it was just like a script. It was just like a mating dance, or he was like an anthropologist, but didn't know the language. He would just say these things. He carried a badge.
Yeah, what did the badge say?
I have no idea. But when it was time to go home, Three Hat Willie would tell everybody they couldn't stay there, honk his horn at him, and flash his badge and run everybody out of the bar. But yeah. I was fascinated. I always enjoyed talking to the guy because he didn't understand social interactions, but he saw how they worked and he would model them. And when he did that, he completely exposed what a farce it was.
This is why I listen to Spanish language music.
Yeah. Yeah, I get it. Three Hat Willie, just like there was another guy, Norman, we called him the Glove Man, always wore gloves. Mm-hmm. And this is when you could smoke in restaurants, and he would go in there and he would start taking things out of his pocket, and it was just tobacco products, Virginia Slims, French cut cigarettes.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I've seen God.
Oh, yeah?
God lived in Chicago Heights, Illinois, and he was an African-American gentleman. Mm-hmm. He was very stylish.
Of course.
Drove a pink Cadillac with the license plate, God. And you'd see him sometimes driving by.
That was either the deity or a pimp.
I'm not going to look behind the curtain. I just figure it was a good epiphany.
Three Hat Willie and the Glove Man were probably in the upper 10.
I think I want to be in the upper 10.
I know I do. But he talks about having asked all kinds of other telling this story to other Americans and asking them what the story meant, and he got a different answer from every person. He just happened to walk into a madman in Oklahoma City one day in 1922, and it just blew his mind.
See the attitude there. It's not he was a madman.
Oh, no.
Presenting him, like immortalizing him in almost poetic language.
He wants to make sense of it. I would just discount it. Oh, he's crazy. But he wants to make sense of it.
Chesterton's a lot of fun.
If he wished to watch over the city in a quiet and unobtrusive fashion, why did he blazon himself all over with the stars of the sky and profess to give public lectures? If he was a detective pretending to be an astronomer, why did he tell a total stranger he was a detective 2 minutes after saying he was an astronomer? He just takes it all for face value. It's so funny.
Just chewing on it on the train, probably.
Three Hat Willie. And at this same time, when he was at the newsstand, he picks up a newspaper and he reads about a case where a member of the Senate in the American Parliament, he says, who was a millionaire and pillar of the Republican Party, which might be called the Respectable Party, is said to be mentioned as a possible president, was embroiled in this lawsuit. And one of the attorneys was Wild Bill McLean. Anyway, he just tells the whole story about his account of the trial. He says, Nero and Borgia were quite presentable people compared with the Senator Hammond when Wild Bill McLean had been done with him.
I think we should have names like that.
Oh, well, yeah.
Wild Bill.
I know some of those. Some Reds. He says there is a certain tone about English trials which does at least begin with a certain skepticism about people prominent in public life. He talks about how Wild Bill McLean uses the Senator Hammond's accomplishments and his wealth against him as an impeachment of his character in the trial, and that McLean would have done better in the trial had he been a poor man or not been a public figure.
But the senator would have done better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. I don't know if that's the case anymore.
I wonder if someone could look up Wild Bill McLean.
McLean was appealing to an implicit public opinion when he pelted. Listen to this alliteration. Appealing to an implicit public opinion when he pelted the senator with his gold. So smart.
Right. Should we go to the end of the book?
Yeah.
All right. So in the section, The Future of Democracy, he said some things. When I read these, I thought, wow. There's some talk about this problem that America had in the past of slavery, and I'll just throw some quotes out. We could chew on them. In England, they preserved aristocracy. In America, they preserved slavery. But he thinks that Jefferson, if you read what Jefferson wrote, Jefferson's not too happy with slavery. He's a practitioner, but not. He's got some writings that I don't have at hand. That this is a problem. We shouldn't do this. And Chesterton says, let's see, one of the best weekly papers in England said recently that even those who drew up the Declaration of Independence did not include Negroes in its generalization about humanity. This is quite consistent with the current convention with which we are all brought up, the theory that the heart of humanity broadens in ever larger circles of brotherhood till we pass from embracing a black man to adoring a black beetle. Okay, so I'll pause right there. This is the story we tell ourselves, is that we're continually progressing, and what we're progressing to is universal. We wouldn't say brotherhood, universal personhood, whatever, where we're extending our circles of care wider and wider and wider. He doesn't think that's the case. The facts show, he says, unfortunately, it's quite inconsistent with the facts of American history. The facts show that in this problem of the Old South, the 18th century was more liberal than the 19th century. There's more sympathy for the Negro in the school of Jefferson than in the school of Jefferson Davis. Jefferson, in the dark estate of his simple deism, said the sight of slavery in his country made him tremble, remembering that God is just. His fellow Southerners, after a century of the world's advance, said that slavery in itself was good, when they did not go farther and say that Negroes in themselves were bad. Okay, so what happened was they got scientific about it. The fact is that the utter separation and subordination of the black like a beast was a progress. It was a growth of 19th century Enlightenment experiment, a triumph of science over superstition. It was when people started to say there's genetic differences. I mean, look at the shapes of their skulls.
It's post-Darwinian.
Yeah, it's...
And it's pragmatic. It's the way the world was going. It's working.
Yeah, you get justifications for it. You get eugenics. Okay? So you get rid of slavery, good. But then you get eugenics, which the Nazis got from the state of Indiana. I'm not making that up. Yeah. You can look it up.
Yeah, the state of Indiana was sterilizing the infirm in the first part of the 20th century and had, at the state fair, would have these weird, not really a beauty pageant, but like selecting the best young men and women as like breeding pairs at the fairs and stuff.
Oh, yeah. No, so one of my TV show I used to like, Longmire, they had an episode where there was some doctor, the bad guy, spoiler, was a doctor who had sterilized Native American women without their consent. And you're like, that can't happen. And you look it up. And sure enough.
Yeah, it did.
It happened. It happened. That's scientific. That's progress. Okay? Think about that. There's no limits on what we can progress to, and there's no limits on what science can do. There's no reverence. I would say sanctity of human life, integrity of the human person. If you are a cog in a big machine, well, we can tweak the cog. Cut a little bit of it out.
Yeah, he calls it a materialistic hardening, which replaced the remorse of Jefferson.
Yeah, he makes a point. He's got a history, I think it's his History of England, or he makes the point that in the Middle Ages, slavery was gotten rid of. So this is an interesting perspective on history. Slavery was constant. It was ubiquitous in the ancient world. A serf is not a slave. There was no slavery in medieval Europe. It went away. It came back with the Renaissance, which was progress. That's a kind of a thorny thing to think, right? That slavery was a culmination of the progress of the European state.
How the hell does that work? Is it because the Enlightenment rejected a mystical idea that there's a recognizable divine spark in all human beings?
That's part of it. Plus you get, well, there's money to be made.
Well, okay.
For sure. You get to read some classical authors where slavery is everywhere, and you start to think they must be right. You find natural slaves everywhere.
Yeah, that's page 4 of Aristotle's Politics, the natural slave.
And so you start finding natural slaves wherever it's convenient for you to harvest the sugar cane.
Mm-hmm.
That's progress, though. You know, it's the height of thinking was, this is fine. This is be careful of progress. You don't know where it's progressing.
Yeah, if man's the rational being and you find people that haven't been taught rationality and syllogism, then they're not humans. Is that how it works?
Mm-hmm.
Is that part of it?
I think so. And maybe you just don't understand the way they think because you laugh at them and then sneer at them.
Right.
And then you can do what you want with them, re-educate them, use them for your wars or whatever. You know, that's the thing about everybody likes to crap on Appalachia, but they sure wanted them to fight their wars.
Still
all
are.
of those Scotch-Irish.
Yep.
I get fired up over this stuff. Chesterton's cheerful, but he pulls no punches, and he hits you. One last quote from me is later in this chapter. The Declaration of Independence dogmatically bases all rights on the fact that God created all men equal, and it is right, for if they were not created equal, they were certainly evolved unequal. There's no basis for democracy except in a dogma about the divine origin of man. That is a perfectly simple fact which the modern world will find out more and more to be a fact. Every other basis is a sort of sentimental confusion full of merely verbal echoes of the older creeds. I don't know where you go with that. Either a human being is something that you don't mess with for your own gain, full stop, or the human being is not. The way the Declaration puts that is endowed by their creator. That works. If you have trouble with the notion of a creator, where are you going to get the notion of not being able to exploit your fellow human being? Kant says you have to treat them like an end in themselves. I like that. I like that formulation. I think it's pretty good. Kant also says even if you don't believe in God, you have to pretend there's one for your morality to make sense. I think he's probably right on that. If you get rid of it, I know this is controversial, but if you get rid of it, then why not do that sort of progress? Why not run Tuskegee experiments? Or that one, what was the one McKay talked about in Oklahoma?
The Robber's Cave.
Yeah, why not do that stuff? Why not do that stuff? Well, you don't do that stuff because a human being has value in himself or herself. That's got to be, I don't know. You have to have reverence for it.
We're not doing Chesterton justice here. You probably ought to go read this, especially if you're mad. Because in this last chapter here on democracy, he calls it the problem of the world, and we need to watch America to figure out how this is going to go. He thinks that the democracy thing, plus the industrialization, is just a toxic brew. And you end up with a plutocracy, and that seems to be being borne out right now, I think. And right there towards the end, he says, it's rich will riot with a brutal indifference far beyond the feeble feudalism which retains some shadow of responsibility or at least of patronage. Its wage slaves will either sink into heathen slavery or seek relief in theories that are destructive not merely in method but in aim, since they are but the negations of the human appetites of property and personality. 18th century ideals formulated in 18th century language have no longer in themselves the power to hold all these pagan passions back. Even those documents depended on deism. Their real strength will survive in men who are still deists, and the men who are still deists are more than deists. Men will more and more realize that there is no meaning in democracy if there's no meaning in anything. This is a heavy-duty book. He's got lots of funny stuff in here and lots of anecdotes, and it's kind of a loose collection of probably newspaper articles, I guess, that they slammed together here, but they all fit in his article, or the next to last chapter on the English character, and then this one on the problem of democracy. Just put a bow on it.
It's challenging.
Yeah, this project is still, I don't like saying young, but he says in here that people say, well, the United States is a young nation, and then implicit in that is that it still has another 800 years because nations get old. And he says, that's just simply not true. He said, you can look over the course of history and see most of them don't last very long.
Yeah. When's the last time you saw a Prussian?
A Prussian, right. An Hungarian, Bulgars. and I wrote in here, is America Lindy? The Lindy effect?
Explain.
The Lindy effect, it's named after some dude named Lindy. The idea is the older something is, the older it will get to be eventually. Like that Coke can right there is not very old. Chances are it'll be thrown in the trash. A Ming vase, people have cared for it for 2,000 years, and it's treasured and will probably be cared for another 2,000 years. Euclid, that the test of time and utility is a fine sieve that selects for the things with the longest longevity.
Okay.
We don't know if the American experience is Lindy. We don't.
Yeah. Well, the Karl effect is.
The Karl effect is?
that things seem like they'll last forever
until they don't.
Right before they end.
Yeah.
The week it's falling apart, you might notice it's falling apart. But 2 weeks before it falls apart, you think it's going to be there forever.
Right.
The United States, who knows if it will endure? Democracies tend not to, or they tend not to as democracies.
Mm-hmm.
Rome endured for a long time. So Rome, 753 to 1453, 2,200 years. I'm counting Constantinople as Rome because it was. They just moved. Okay.
See, Karl, he just declared that it was.
Yeah. But what did Augustus do? But fundamentally change it. It was no longer a republic. It looked like one, but it wasn't.
Yeah. We've been saying democracy, and he says it's democracy. America's not a democracy, and it never was. It's a republic, but it's not the same thing it was. It's already not what it was.
Mm-hmm. Who knows? It might last 2,000 years, but it won't be what it was.
No. That might be for the better. I don't know. I kind of miss what I think it was, but I wasn't here.
Yeah.
When I go to Colonial Williamsburg, I can't hardly even get around. I can't hardly even see it. I'm just in tears. It just destroys me, the sense of loss I have when I go to that place.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like that in England too, a lot, and Ireland.
Well, there's, that Yeats poem about the center not holding.
Yeah.
And that what rough beast slouches towards Bethlehem waiting to be born. Something's coming. You just don't know what it is. I don't know what the moral of the story is. If there's anything good about what America has been, I think it's in the Declaration. It's in that notion of inalienable rights.
Well, it's in that, and it's in the people too.
Yeah.
It's a particular kind of person that will get on a wooden ship and jump off on the edge of the water way to shore and carve something out where there wasn't nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And they have particular kind of parenting style, so they have a particular kind of kid, and so on.
We went through East Tennessee. There's a valley that you can go through. I think Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I think, and you can drive around this valley, and you can get out of your car. You walk up to this log cabin that somebody, I forget his name. I should remember his name. That somebody went out there with an axe in 1785 and made himself a house. That's still there. And like, this is for me, when Calypso hands Odysseus an axe and says, go make a raft, and he does. For me, this is a bit of what those sorts of people were that I don't think I am, where you could give him an axe and he could go get his sustenance and get his shelter in a place where nobody had ever been. That was something unique. Europe hadn't had that for 1,000 years.
No. 2 falls ago, we drove out east of here, and we stopped in Clio Springs, Oklahoma, and there's a sod house there. And I just looked it up. I forgot the guy's name. A guy named Marshall McCulley was in a land run. He left Kansas. Somebody shot a rifle up in the air at high noon, and they had a land run, and he went to this property in Clio Springs. He had a shovel and a pistol and some coins, and he lost some of the coins, and a book of stamps, and he built a sod house. He took that shovel and he cut sod and built a house, and he and his wife lived in that house for 15 or 18 years. He eventually built a frame house, and they kept the sod house, and it was a smokehouse for a while. And his kids essentially built a barn over the sod house to protect it and keep it. And then they gave it to the state of Oklahoma. And you can go out there, and the hand-dug cellar that he dug that they kept their canning in was there. The guy went and built something where there was absolutely nothing but wind and weather. And I go in there just cry and cry and cry.
Yeah, well,
Unbelievable.
yeah, it was something unique, something that hadn't been seen for a while.
And once he had that sod house, he went back to Kansas, found a woman, made her a wife, and brought her back.
Come back to my sod house.
Yeah.
I wonder what the courtship was.
Okay, now's when I gripe. Wait a minute, more. You know, we get told about how great the country is and our Constitution and all that stuff. But how much of this greatness is the fact that a young guy could walk across the border from Kansas into Indian Territory, or that was Oklahoma Territory, not Indian Territory, and instantly be capitalized with no debt? If you had a shovel and were willing to bust your ass and live there for 7 years and improve it, you could have it. You were instantly in business if you were willing to do it and could.
Mm-hmm.
No money down. No payments to anybody. It was you and nature and your will. We say, oh, the Industrial Revolution, the explosive economic growth in the United States, and then our form of government, and all those things are wonderful. But a 17-year-old could leave Kansas and be a self-sufficient person with a shovel.
Well,
that's never that hasn't happened, but just a handful of times in the history of mankind.
I don't know if it would be, well, everything's weird now, who knows? But I don't know that it would be entirely wrong if we didn't just not ever think about it. So a 17-year-old, 18-year-old probably doesn't even think of, going and starting something. Oh, I got to go to college. Well, I got to go into debt and spend 4 or 5 years or 6 years sitting in a college and delaying my life, come out of it with debt. Who could get married then?
Right.
So family gets pushed off. Maybe you have, I don't know, you don't have many kids. So it's not that it couldn't be done absolutely. I mean, there's not too many frontiers you can go and get a homestead. Although there are towns that would pay you to move there.
Mm-hmm.
That's not New York City. We drove through East Colorado. There's empty towns out there. There's places to go. But we don't really think about it. We think, no, you got to do this. It's constrained.
Listen to this. I just looked on their website, okhistory.org. You can look up sod house. So there was a land run in the Cherokee Outlet, September 16th, 1893. Macaulay first lived in a one-room dugout hollowed out of a ravine bank. He dug a hole and lived in the ground like a fucking prairie dog. And then he built a 2-room sod house in August of 1894 using blocks of thick buffalo grass blanketing the Oklahoma prairies. He hitched his team to a sod plow and split the grass in long rows, blah, blah, blah. He received his homestead certificate, the title and deed, in 1902, and they lived in that sod house until 1909. Crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not.
It's what your people who went before you did, for most of you out there. You might have forgotten it, but they did it. They did great deeds that should be honored. Like Chesterton talks about, somebody needs to write about how great the English are. Like people write about Irish, or Lawrence wrote about Arabia. We did this in passing. I joke that's why I like country music. It's a celebration of a culture, of all the good things about it and the bad things. But it's honoring it and preserving it. And I think that's good. I mean, gosh, people go dig up like Yugoslavian folk songs to preserve them. But Hank Williams isn't cool.
I don't know if there's anybody cooler than Hank Williams. I don't know how much Chesterton that is. This is a good bathroom book too.
Yeah,
you can each chapter stands alone. They're mostly 15-minute chapters, I'd say.
Yeah, let me give you some more Chesterton that you could read, dear listener. The Heretics and Orthodoxy are a double set. Heretics is where he takes on people like his friend George Bernard Shaw and says why they're wrong about everything. And then they pestered him into writing a book called Orthodoxy, which is to talk about what's right and what he actually thinks. It's like when Socrates' friends yell at him in the Republic, well, you never said what you think. And so he does that. He's got a wonderful short biographies of Thomas Aquinas and Francis of Assisi, which are real good. They're a bit more religious, but perfect book on Thomas Aquinas. I think it's Etienne Gilson who wrote about this, that Aquinas was in the middle of writing. I'm sorry, Chesterton. So I'm going to write a book on Thomas Aquinas. And he's halfway through the book, and he stops, and he asks his secretary, go get me all the books, the current scholarship on Aquinas. And he reads a couple pages, puts the books back, keeps writing his book. He was a newspaper man. He wasn't a theologian. He got it right. He got it right. It's a real good introduction to Aquinas. He's got a short history of England, which is fun. One of his friends is Hilaire Belloc, so you might read some of his stuff too. The Father Brown mysteries are fun, short. Talk about bathroom reading. You can get one of those done per visit, probably, depending on your intestinal state. Poetry. We don't talk about the poetry. He was a poet, and he is a good poet. You can pick up a collection of his poetry and dig through that. There's a Ballad of the White... Somebody correct me. It's a famous poem. The Ballad of the White Horse, I think, that he did. He was an artist. You can look up his drawings. He went to art school. An interesting fellow. There's a whole lot there that you could dig into.
Did he get us wrong anywhere in that book?
Did he get...
us wrong, the Americans wrong?
I wasn't there in 1922. I don't think so. One of the things that he talks about a lot is how we abbreviate words by making them longer.
Yeah.
Like a lift is an elevator.
Yeah. He's fascinated by our houses are all made out of wood.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that.
Yeah.
In England, it's all stone.
Yeah, they cut all their trees down and made houses out of them before there was paint.
Uh-huh.
And they have no conifers.
Well, they might have used them all in the Napoleonic Wars.
The conifers?
Well, how many for the mast?
Well, that's their hardwoods. See, this is my theory.
Okay.
They don't have any conifers to speak of. That's the fast-growing stuff. That's your Doug fir and your pines that you get the good 2x4s out of that grow fast. So they've got their English oak, and they cut them all down to build houses, and there's no paint. They can't preserve it. The house rots to the ground before the next one's mature.
So they have to pile up rocks.
You end up stone and brick houses and thatch roofs instead of cedar shingles, and much different.
Yeah.
They ain't wrong, though, by the way.
They ain't wrong building out of stone.
Yeah, they ain't wrong. The little pigs knew.
But I think that's neat. An Englishman comes here, and the thing that strikes him is wooden houses.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so you can read what he writes, and then perhaps you can realize something unique about where you live, that wood is so plentiful you can have a wooden house. In Orthodoxy, he tells a story about the traveler going across the world to see something new. He's bored with what he's got. And then he comes back to his home country, and he doesn't recognize it. And he sees the wonder of how everything he has is... Everything on that island is so glorious, but it's his home. So you can do this displacement and recover what is unique, irreplaceable, invaluable about where you live and what you are from reading what this 300-pound Englishman wrote about it 100 years ago. A
lot of Englishmen. Well, I think we beat this. We're getting ready to open enrollment again. We'll see what happens. We'll see how many people lived through this pandemic.
We'd love to have you.
Yeah, go to onlinegreatbooks.com/podcast, and you can sign up to join us there. We'll be open enrollment on the 18th. We'll be open for 7 days, so you ought to be able to get in on that. And then next week, we are going to read P.G. Woodhouse's Wodehouse, Inimitable Jeeves.
We are? Okay.
Yeah,
awesome.
We already talked about it because you're already reading it. We're getting a twofer. We're getting a twofer on that.
I've got many things on my mind. Boy, we pushed some buttons on this episode. I wonder if any of you are going to be real mad at us.
Good.
It's all right. Come at me.
Just because they voted on it doesn't mean we can't still talk about it.
That's right. Look, what is this show about? It's about pointing to beautiful things, poking at you.
The science isn't settled, Karl. I'm so sick of science. That's for another show. All right, guys. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye.